Hi, and thanks very much for the invitation to do this. This is the room where I do my writing. It's also the spare bedroom, so I hope you'll forgive the mess. I'm going to read a piece from my current book, The Paper Bracelet. And just to put it in context, The Paper Bracelet tells the story of a woman called Katie, who is recently widowed. She's approaching 70 years of age. And Katie, in her younger years, almost 50 years before, had worked as a nurse in a mother and baby home, a fictional place called Carrickbrack in County Clare. And she decides that what she's going to do is to retrieve some mementos she had from that time, a dark and difficult time for her. And these include paper bracelets, the little identity bands worn by babies. And she reckons that if people are still looking for their birth mothers, if they want to find where they came from, that she has the information that should be able to help them. Now, interspersed with Katie's story is the story of a young woman called Patricia, who gave birth in that same fictional mother and baby home, a place called Carrickbrack. And the chapter I'm going to read features Patricia and the others in that home, and a couple of the nuns, including Sister Sabina, who was probably the cruelest nun in the place, because I should also say that some of those there were kind to Patricia. Anyway, this is part of her story. And again, I should warn you that there's singing in this, and my voice isn't brilliant, but I'll do my best. This is chapter 9 of The Paper Bracelet. Then Patricia. It started with the rat. They were in the walled garden, picking strawberries, when it ran across Jacinta's foot. Jacinta was a tall, snippy girl from the Ennis Road in Limerick. Patricia knew where she was from because she mentioned it a lot. Although the Ennis Road meant nothing to most of them, they guessed it was a well-to-do area and that Jacinta wanted everyone to understand that she wasn't a lower-class scrubber. She also moaned a lot about getting fat. I wonder, said Winnie, if she's noticed that she's single, 9 months pregnant and living in a prison full of women. She might have more serious problems than putting on a few pounds. The rat, a greasy, long-tailed creature, scurried over Jacinta's foot before veering left into the blackcurrant bushes. Many girls would have shuddered. A hardy few would have taken it in their stride. Jacinta began squealing. In a blink, she was bawling like a banshee. Sister Sabina, who was a short distance away, shouted at her to stop. When her instruction was ignored, she tried again. "Quieten down, will you?" she said, her voice twanging with irritation. "It was only a mouse." "It was a rat," said Jacinta. "A dirty, disgusting rat. He could have bitten me. My baby could have died." "Whatever it was, it's gone, so put an end to your snivelling there and get back to work." Jacinta resumed her keening. The June day was warm, the sun prickling their skin. If you asked Patricia, Jacinta shouldn't have been at work. She should have been inside with her feet up, waiting for her big day. Her baby was due within the next couple of weeks. Patricia herself was hot and uncomfortable, and her baby wasn't due for 2 months. Jacinta was a messy crier, her face scrunched up with misery, her body shaking. Eventually, Sabina walked over and slapped her, thwack, across the cheek. For half a moment, Jacinta stopped, only to start up again even louder than before. Sabina administered another slap and received the same response. Jacinta had worked herself into a frenzy. Patricia was disturbed by the scene. Although they were treated like errant schoolgirls, most of them, Jacinta included, were grown women. No matter that the regime was strict, the nuns weren't supposed to engage in physical punishment. Winnie stood up. "Ah, sister," she said, "will you look at the cut of her and her about to give birth at any minute? She's in a bad way." "Winnie, this is none of your concern. You've a job to do. Those strawberries won't pick themselves." "She has a point, though," said Patricia, getting to her feet too. "Imagine if Jacinta was so upset that something happened to her or the baby. I gather her parents are well connected." Jacinta gave a loud sniffle of acknowledgement. Patricia raised an eyebrow at Sabina, her way of saying, "I have the measure of you." The letter from her parents, in which they'd essentially said that Mike's happiness and well-being were more important than hers, had knocked something loose in her. She was less deferential than before, less respectful. She also dwelled on what they'd said about Mike's wife. Patricia hadn't known that Vera was pregnant. The information made her feel dirty. Winnie looked at her and nodded. As I understand it, Sister, Jacinta's people have a fair bit of money. As often as the Carrickbrack women were told that they were all the same, they knew this was untrue. Some sinners were more equal than others. For at least a minute they stood there staring at each other. 6 girls who'd been working nearby also got to their feet. One of them, a tiny little thing who said she was 14 but might be younger, looked terrified. Finally, Sabina sighed and said, "This pathetic behaviour is distracting us from our task. Come on, Jacinta. You'd better go indoors for a while so you can regain control of yourself. The rest of you can return to the strawberries. I'll be back shortly and have no doubt if I hear any chatter, there will be consequences." She glanced at Jacinta. "Like I always say, empty vessels make the most sound." In Sabina's absence, they worked slowly. As Winnie put it, 1 strawberry for the bucket, 1 for the mouth. Patricia and the others followed her example. It wasn't as though they were stealing from their own table. Most of the soft fruit was either sold or turned into jam. The girls rarely got jam, and on such a hot day the strawberries were delicious. The food in Carrickbrack was meagre and poorly cooked. Their diet consisted of porridge, soup, bread and fatty bacon. Everything was either too watery or too lumpy, too cold or guaranteed to scald your mouth. They suspected the nun who ran the kitchen went out of her way to ensure the meals were borderline inedible. Otherwise they might get pleasure from their food, and pleasure was forbidden. They ate because they were hungry and because their babies deserved the nutrition. "All we need is a jug of cream," said Patricia, wiping the juice from her chin. Winnie grinned. "Aren't you the fancy one with your cream?" "My father used to say, I don't know where you get your notions from." "Are you sure he's not related to my old man? He says exactly the same thing." When she wasn't chewing or teasing Patricia, Winnie was singing to herself. After Sabina returned, she continued. While her friend wasn't especially tuneful, Patricia thought she recognised the mountains of Mourne. "How many times do you have to be told to work in silence?" said the nun. "We're not allowed to talk. Nobody told us not to sing." "I'm telling you." "Grand so," said Winnie, who hummed instead. Sabina walked towards her. "You're determined to cause trouble, aren't you?" "Not really. We've had some cheap straps in here, but you're among the worst of them. I always thought that some girls are led astray and others, God help them, are abused. But the likes of you, you're pure bad. If I had my way, you'd be kept in here indefinitely." Patricia wondered if Sabina genuinely believed this. If so, what had happened to sour her view of human nature and strip her of empathy? Yes, Winnie could be cheeky, but she was also as kind as the day was long. She'd been the first to support Jacinta, a girl she didn't particularly like. Winnie stood up. "Hold on. Jacinta was warming to her theme. "You're a disgrace to your family. No wonder they threw you out. Mind you, they've questions to answer themselves. If they'd made any attempt to teach you right from wrong, you'd still be above in Sligo studying your books. Now do as you're told." Again, Winnie looked like she wanted to say something. Instead, she paused, stuck out her chin, and began to sing. "I believe that when writing a wish you expressed." She faltered, and for what felt like an agonisingly long time, there was silence. Patricia looked at her friend. There were tears in her eyes, a reminder that for all her bravado, she was only 16. Patricia stood and finished the line. "As to how the fine ladies in London are dressed." From the other side of the garden, a third girl joined them. "Well, if you believe me when asked to a ball." And then a fourth. "They don't wear no tops to their dresses at all." By the time they'd reached the final line, all 8 workers were singing. "That's enough," said Sabina, with a brisk clap of her hands. "In fact, that's more than enough. I want you to get back to work, except you, Winnie. You're coming inside with me." Patricia didn't know many songs, and most of those she did know were religious. But the warmth of the day and the nastiness of Sabina's words had combined to create a restive atmosphere. This was no time to give up. She cleared her throat and began. "When boyhood's fire was in my blood, I read of ancient free men, For Greece and Rome who bravely stood, 300 men and 3 men. Once more, Winnie and the others joined in. That only a couple of them had strong voices didn't matter. When they all came together, they sounded formidable. Sabina hadn't bargained for mass insubordination. "You'll stop that racket," she said, "and you'll stop it immediately, do you hear?" Emboldened, they sang on. Their repertoire was short but varied. After A Nation Once Again, they tried Daydream Believer. This segued into Hey Jude, which somehow led to On Puck Er Bwilla. Here they were, cut off from the rest of the world, with no audience but themselves, their voices lifting and soaring. They sang with spirit and exuberance, and occasionally they even sang in tune. When they forgot the words, they la-la-la'd. When a girl paused for breath, another took over. At one point, Patricia's baby delivered an almighty kick, but still she sang. They were a ragtag bunch, their stomachs swelling against their ugly uniforms, their hair tied up in top knots, their faces pink from heat and exertion. They'd been assaulted, abandoned, discarded, left in the lurch. They'd been branded, insulted and punished. They were sluts, tramps, whores, fallen women. Their babies would be taken from them without consideration or permission. And still they sang. At first, Sabina shouted at them. When this didn't deliver, she poured scorn upon them, their families and their pregnancies. She spoke in an assortment of monosyllables and grunts. At one stage, she mentioned the devil. She was no fool, however, and after a while she went in search of reinforcements. Presumably, she also hoped her absence would bring their singing to a halt. Briefly, they did stop. The sun was scorching through the cloth of their uniforms and beating down on their bare heads. They needed a rest. The arrival of Sister Agnes rekindled their enthusiasm. Oh, and there was something else, something remarkable. The respite was long enough for them to hear the faint but unmistakable sound of black velvet band drifting from the main house. Their protest had spread. Agnes was white with anger. 2 deep pleats formed at the top of her nose. She made no attempt to silence the women, however. She told them to leave the buckets of strawberries behind and return to the house. 2 by 2, they linked arms and, like refugees from a musical Noah's Ark, did as she asked. On their way, they sang The West's Awake. Inside, they were met by more singing. From the kitchen, they could hear All You Need Is Love. The girls in the laundry sang the Raggle Tackle Gypsy, while in the nursery a lone voice performed Oklahoma. Several babies did their best to follow the soloist's lead. Sister Agnes and some of the other nuns ushered all the women into the refectory and closed the doors. They would be corralled there until thirst, exhaustion, or the need to go to the lavatory forced them to stop. Patricia saw Sister Eunice standing beside a dresser. The nun smiled before turning away. For an hour or more the women continued, pausing only to listen to Bernadette, a shy slip of a girl from Tipperary. It was unusual to hear her speak, let alone sing. She stood at the top of the room, closed her eyes and sang We Shall Overcome. Her voice was powerful and pure. None of them would have guessed at her talent. Even as Bernadette's voice floated over the room, and even as Patricia hummed along, she knew it was a lie. She doubted that all of them would overcome. She also knew that this harmless revolt would be punished. In that moment, though, they were united against a common opposition. Not just the nuns, but every damn thing that had caused them to be trapped in Carrickbrack. What Patricia felt then was as close to joy as she had experienced in a long time. Thank you.